great. All right, thanks everyone for coming so much. Appreciate it. We'll go ahead and get started. They got the doors closed for us, so I think we're ready to go. And yeah, before I do start, this is a crypto means cryptology talk, so buckle up for that, if you're not already. So what this is, it's really a love story. It's a love story that begins and ends with a rather powerful concept, a concept of what really makes a person powerful isn't anything in the traditional senses of power, not strength or force, but that knowledge itself is power. And that is a quote from Francis Bacon, who was an English philosopher who lived in the 17th century. That's the time of Shakespeare, the colonization of North America, and when the foundations of a lot of modern science was being laid. And yes, Francis Bacon is the bacon in the title of this presentation, so I just want to get that out there right away that I'm sorry to disappoint any bacon lovers that were expecting difference. Collective groan, yeah, exactly, yeah. The groan tells me that the title worked. But while Bacon's quote itself kind of begins our story together, it ends with that same quote on the tombstone of another man. His name's William Friedman. And yet again, our story isn't even about William, but about his better half in more ways than one, Elizabeth Smith Freeman. So Elizabeth is the one who decided to put knowledge is power on her husband's tombstone at the end of his life and the end of their life together. She also embedded in that quote a secret code, one that reminded her of how they met and how they ended up spending their lives together, lives that saw the foundation of a modern scientific method, one that you and I rely on every day and is central to everything we do to secure ourselves, our knowledge, from those who would seek to gain its power. So before I introduce myself then, I'd like to introduce you to Elizabeth Smith. Elizabeth is spelled with 2 E's and no A. She was the youngest of 9 children, and that might be why she said her mother chose this unusual spelling of Elizabeth to help set her apart. She was born in a small town in Indiana and raised on a farm by her Quaker dairy farming father and mother. Her father actually could trace his lineage all the way back to a Quaker who sailed to America in 1682 on the same boat as William Penn of the famous other Commonwealth, Pennsylvania. And from a young age, she knew that she was going to be destined for something different than the ordinary. She could feel herself wanting to kind of break out of tradition, break the mold, and plot her own course. It actually led her to defy her father's wishes and attend college. And after college even, the prescribed path for her, which would be, working in education and in high school education and living at home with her parents, that didn't work for her either. So she left her parents and headed to Chicago, hoping to find a job there doing something interesting or something unusual, and boy, did she ever. And I'm really excited to tell you that story and talk about Elizabeth today. My name is Brendan. It's actually my first year ever at RVAsec that I've ever attended, and I'm speaking, so I'm really honored to do that. Back in December, I was given the opportunity to join ProjectDiscovery, which is the makers of open source tools like Nuclei, Subfinder, HTTPX, and many others, and I was really excited to join this community. I spent most of my career up until now in developer tooling. Most recently, I was at GitLab for about 5 years and saw the power that open source can bring on problems that real practitioners face, not just the ones that look good to demo or sell well when suits are selling to other suits. So I hope you'll indulge me a little bit here with Elizabeth's story. I promise if you stick around, I'll apply it to our day-to-day lives, working to secure ourselves and our organizations. I just also think there's something special to be learned about the history of what Elizabeth did and what parts of that she did and did not get credit for until much more recently, and even how she came to do any of it in the first place. So, Elizabeth had always really been interested in history and language, and learned that when she was in Chicago that an obscure library, the Newberry Library, is a private library, there was this rare and unique piece of history called the First Folio. So in Shakespeare's time, the spoken word was valued much more highly than the written word. And so while he was alive, actually, none of his plays were actually recorded and printed in any meaningful way. And it wasn't until 7 years after his death that a group of admirers of his works gathered 36 of them and put them in a published book. And the act of publishing that first folio was actually in itself a radical act to suggest that some mere mortal man's works deserved the same treatment and preservation techniques that at the time was really only reserved for the Bible. And not many copies of this first folio exist, and in the early 1900s, the Newberry Library had one of the few copies that were available in the Americas. And Elizabeth's curiosity and desire for something new drove her to go to Newberry Library and see it. And that would actually start this chain of events that would lead to this founding of the modern science of cryptology. So when Elizabeth got to the library, she started talking to the librarian about the folio and what Elizabeth was going to do next. And the librarian remembered this eccentric millionaire who was looking for someone just like Elizabeth. And actually within the next hour, George Fabian showed up to the library, absconded with Elizabeth into his limousine, took her to a train station, took her up to Geneva, Illinois, to his estate called Riverbank. And at Riverbank, Fabian, seen here with Elizabeth, had assembled scientists and inquisitive minds from all over the country. He footed the bill for them while they experimented with a wide-ranging set of topics, from botany to genetics to acoustics. And most critically to Elizabeth, one of Fabian's most prized projects involved the first folio itself and a theory about the true author of Shakespeare's masterpieces. So at Riverbank, there was another woman named Mrs. Elizabeth Wells Gallup, with the traditional Z-A spelling of Elizabeth rather than our Elizabeth, Z-E. And she had started the Riverbank Cipher School. And her cipher, of course, is, a way of disguising code, writing, right, a code. And Mrs. Gallup had been working for years on a secret code that she believed was embedded inside the first folio. A secret code that, if proven correct, would completely change our understanding not only of English literature, but of the entire history of the United Kingdom as well. So here I've got to take a little detour and talk about the cipher that Mrs. Gallup was pursuing in the first folio. At the time that he was alive, Bacon actually revealed that he invented this new type of cipher, a method to signify what he called omnia per omnia, or anything by means of anything. And that insight led to him to the discovery that he was able to represent all of the letters of the alphabet using only 2 letters. So if you combine them in permutations of 5-letter blocks, and at the time I and J and U and V were kind of interchangeable, so the Bacon alphabet that he proposed kind of looked like this. And yes, this is also very much the part of a theory that later Claude Shannon would come to refine. Claude Shannon was, the American mathematician, electrical engineer, and a cryptographer, actually in his own right, known as the father of modern digital communication information theory. Parts of that theory from Claude Shannon evolved into our modern view of information theory, binary code, right, that we see here, used to represent all the world's data today. But Shannon actually wasn't around yet. In fact, in 1916, when Elizabeth came to Riverbank, that's also the year Shannon was born. So history has like a funny way of putting these kind of coincidences together, but I'm like on a tangent here. So Mrs. Gallup believed that, and actually had written an entire book, in fact, that the printers of the first folio had used this kind of A-B form of letters, like how they printed the letters themselves, differences in the characters, A form and B form, to embed a Bacon cipher into the document itself. And she had been translating some of these biliteral ciphertext, right, that's what it would be called, into real text. And what she found disturbed her to the very core and actually made headlines in newspapers in her day. That Francis Bacon himself was actually the author of all of the works of Shakespeare and others, and that he was actually the illegitimate son of Queen Elizabeth and thus the rightful heir to the throne of England. So Mrs. Gallup had actually been doing this work for 20 years at the point that Elizabeth showed up, and many people believed this Baconian theory of the works of Shakespeare. Even Mark Twain and Nathaniel Hawthorne believed that this was possible. but the proof had always been elusive. Mrs. Gallup thought she had proof, a scientific method of identifying the A or B form of the letters in a reproducible way. But what she needed now was someone to reproduce it, and that's where Elizabeth came in. Mrs. Gallup set Elizabeth to work to try and reproduce her results with kind of a vague and hard to understand description of the biformed alphabet. It would be slight differences in the stem of an H or a tilt in the ovals of a G, right? Elizabeth likened this to trying to sort blueberries by color or beach pebbles by smoothness. So she required Mrs. Gallup's help, actually, in the beginning to even get through the first 24-word translation. But from there, she set out on her own, trying her best to reproduce these translations that Mrs. Gallup had created. And for weeks, she continued in this work, trying her best to interpret what Mrs. Gallup had created. And while the work was very tedious, she was enjoying the cool Illinois summer. She was doing something unusual like she wanted. And while she was there, she also met William Friedman, who was at the time an aspiring geneticist, and he was raising fruit flies to try and understand the role of genes. And keep in mind, this is still 40 years before the discovery of the double helix shape of DNA. So again, very kind of groundbreaking science they're attempting to do. And Elizabeth and William had this kind of instant friendship. They cultivated that on the weekends and in between work. They understood one another and trusted the intellect that each other had in a way that was different than other folks at Riverbank. Most were very content to be paid to do interesting work and not ask too many questions. William was aware of the cipher project as well because he was the resident photographer there at Riverbank, and he was the one who made the enlargements of the folio for Mrs. Gallup to use. And he was also fascinated with ciphers, and that led him to embed hidden messages in the botany sketches he would make, right? It would look like any other botanical illustration, but then there'd be words like bacon and Shakespeare hidden in the stem of a plant or something like that. And as that summer turned to autumn and winter, Elizabeth and William knew that they were growing closer, but were unsure of what to call their relationship. But that growing closeness led her to build up the courage to share something that she had been thinking about for all these months, something that had been kind of eating away from her, and something that was sacrilegious to even think, much less speak, at Riverbank, which is there are no hidden messages in Shakespeare. And Elizabeth was relieved to find that William shared these same doubts. They asked themselves, what if everyone involved in this bacon work was just delusional, except for the two of them? What would that mean for their work and their lives that they had kind of committed themselves to here? But before they had a chance to answer that question, a much more pressing matter would change the course of their lives together even more. So at 11 a.m. on February 27th, 1917, the Secretary of State of the United States at the time, Robert Livingston, carried a copy of an intercepted telegram that had made its way up the chain in Washington after arriving from London to show it to President Woodrow Wilson. And President Wilson's only response upon reading it was, "Good Lord." So this telegram had been sent from Germany to Mexico a month before and was encoded in numeric blocks. You can see them here. And when it was translated over the intervening month in a British code-breaking office, what they found was actually a conspiracy and plot against the United States. So this was sent by the German Empire's Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmerman to the German ambassador in Mexico, and this telegram would later be known as simply the Zimmerman telegram. And it proposed that if the United States entered the war on the side of the Allies, Mexico should join the Central Powers as Germany's ally, and in return, Germany would provide military and financial support for Mexico in order to help it regain territories that it had lost to the United States, including Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. So previous to this, the United States had been neutral in the conflict, but the proposal of this alliance between Germany and Mexico, which included this possibility of an attack directly on the United States, really outraged the public and caused this huge shift in public opinion towards entering the war and entering the war on the side of the Allies. And President Wilson used this Zimmerman telegram as the justification for asking Congress to declare war on Germany in April of 1917. And the revelation of this Zimmerman telegram also had long-lasting impacts on international relations. It showed the importance of cryptology and code breaking in warfare. And at the time, George Fabian at Riverbank Labs had the nation's only code breaking school and team, William Friedman and the soon-to-be Mrs. Freedman, Elizabeth Smith. And so this was the moment that Elizabeth had been unknowingly waiting for kind of her whole life, the moment that defines the rest of her life. And in fact, the fact that she was able to trust herself, trust her instincts at 23 years old, will not only launch 1,000 ships, but will eventually save thousands of lives on ships. It leads not only to the birth of just the Freemans' eventual children, but the birth of a new science, a science that we take for granted today in our day-to-day lives. Right? Cryptology touches every aspect of our lives today, and most humans interact with it every day without thinking about it. But the start of the First World War, Elizabeth and William were two of only literally a handful of people who understood enough about cryptology to even start looking at these encrypted messages. And so Fabian is quick to volunteer Riverbank to the effort, and Elizabeth and William to the war effort. And in previous conflicts, code breakers hadn't mattered as much, right? Before the days of radio transmission, if you wanted to intercept a military message, it involved, like capturing a messenger on horseback or, some sort of exploitation of the postal service maybe. But the Great War was different than previous because radio allowed wireless communication over great distances, but then it also enabled anyone with a receiver to pick up any message that you were sending. And so this meant the powers on both sides of the war were fighting to find the best ciphers and the best methods to encrypt the messages they were sending. And that's where William and Elizabeth came in. Placed in charge of the new Riverbank division of ciphers, they would together not only become the main source of decrypting enemy messages for the United States, but also create some of the seminal works that serve as the foundation of this type of work to today. They'd coined the term cryptanalyst to describe it, and they started decoding messages. And then they also published the Riverbank publications, most of which they worked on together, even though only a few actually mention Elizabeth as a co-author. And those publications codified a lot of the knowledge that they had gained through study, through understanding the frequencies of letters and letter groupings in different languages, the index of coincidence, and various other methods to get around ciphers at the time. And these methods are at the very foundation of cryptology, right? Let's take, for example, one of the simplest ciphers we can think of. This is called a monoalphabetic cipher, or mask. This is where you just change one letter for another. For instance, if you were in the English alphabet, you might change A to X, B to Y, C to Z, and so on, right? So this is one of the most basic ciphers that you could create. It's called monoalphabetic because the alphabet stays the same for the duration of the entire message. And these ciphers can even be found dating back to the time of Caesar. There's even a specific type of monoalphabetic cipher that's named for Caesar. But even with this simplest of cipher methods, there are over 403 septillion possible alphabets that you can create. That's on the order of 10 to the 24th power, which is roughly, very roughly, but close enough, on par with the number of stars in the known universe. It's a number so large that 1,000 computers testing 1 million alphabets a second would take more than 1 billion years to try every possible alphabet. But this is also the kind of cipher that you'll find on like the back of a box of Cracker Jacks or a newspaper puzzle page, right? Like these are ciphers that, given the right conditions, like an inexperienced person can break on a Sunday, right? So how's this possible? Well, it's possible because we can start to identify patterns, right? This is the essence of code breaking, pattern identification. And it's something humans have evolved to be very good at doing, right? Taking what appears to be chaotic input and finding patterns in that chaos. This is the most important skill of a code breaker, at least definitely one in the time of Elizabeth and William. It's not pure math skills necessarily, right? Elizabeth was a poet. William was a botanist by their training, but the ability to pay attention, to look for patterns in what appears to be chaotic in a patternless environment, that was critical. And I want to return to this idea of patterns again, but let's go back to the wartime efforts for a second. So their efforts in World War I were very well documented, especially with the publication of that research we talked about. In fact, for the first 8 months of the war, Riverbank did 100% of all of the code breaking for every part of the United States government: the State Department, the War Department, the Navy, Department of Justice. And not only that, they would go on to be the main training ground for when those various departments decided that they wanted to expand their own in-house code breaking capabilities. Code breaking and code making were invading every part of William and Elizabeth's lives together. And even here in this picture, so this picture is from one of their training classes, they embedded a secret code in the style of Francis Bacon, an AB cipher, where the folks with their head kind of turned at this weird angle here, where the B form, spelling out in the entire photograph, which we can't see here, it goes out to the edge, the famous Bacon phrase, "knowledge is power." And then after the war, the government had, kind of concluded that, hey, this code breaking and this kind of modern world of radio communication, they're going to be around for a while. And so Elizabeth and William would actually end up leaving Riverbank and finding new careers in this emerging field. She began working for the Coast Guard, which at the time was part of the Department of the Treasury. And in 1927, when the government came knocking, they were asking her for help with a new challenge. So during Prohibition, illegal alcohol smuggling and distribution became a very lucrative business for organized crime groups. So to evade law enforcement, they used sophisticated codes and ciphers in their communications. And the Coast Guard was uniquely positioned to intercept these messages because they had lots of listening stations to listen for, up and down the coast for ships in peril. And Elizabeth's talents were critical in deciphering and in analyzing those messages to expose those criminal networks and disrupt operations. So Elizabeth's code-breaking work was not only integral to the apprehension of major crime figures at this time, but also provided crucial evidence in numerous legal cases. Her work led to successful prosecution and dismantling of a lot of bootlegging operations, and she testified in a number of cases. Most notably, probably, it was the 1933 case, I'm Alone. So that was a Canadian smuggling ship named I'm Alone, and it was sunk by the U.S. Coast Guard. And Elizabeth was called to prove that the ship was actually involved in illegal activities by enciphering or deciphering the messages sent between the ship and the criminal associates on shore. And so throughout her kind of tenure at the Coast Guard, Freeman played this critical role in shaping the agency's reputation in counterintelligence. Her work, again, laid the foundation for this modern-day code-breaking and cryptology practices within the Coast Guard and then other government agencies as well. And as her reputation grew, newspapers started to feature her prominently, right? She was testifying in these public cases. And they often referred to her as America's first female cryptanalyst and highlighted her career in code breaking, codes that seemed impenetrable at first. They were also full of plenty of focus on her as a middle-aged woman, which she resented very much, and almost always called her the pretty code-breaking lady. So Elizabeth wasn't a huge fan of the way that fame kind of happened, but it did help raise awareness about cryptanalysts and its importance on national security. And it was overshadowed at the time with some of the work that William was doing for the Army. But William was always tormented by the fact that his hands were tied when it came to sharing information, right? Because it was very secret, versus Elizabeth's work at the time was public, and there were public cases about it. Ironically, Elizabeth didn't like the press attention that the cases were gaining for her, right? So, interestingly enough, their roles would soon flip. And Elizabeth would happily, for herself, fade into the background. But that change also meant that her amazing accomplishments that came next, in the next World War, were for years overshadowed by her husband's efforts in founding the Army Signal Corps that eventually became the National Security Agency. But in some ways, Elizabeth's work in World War II was even more unbelievable than William's. So during World War II, Elizabeth's expertise played this pivotal role in the identification and apprehension of Nazi spies and the decryption of their secret messages. Her work was instrumental both before and after the United States officially entered the war in 1941. So in the years leading up to the U.S. entry in the war, Freeman worked closely with British intelligence, sharing her knowledge and assisting them in the effort to decipher encrypted communications from Nazi spies from Germany to the Americas. And as a result, she contributed significantly to exposing those rings and capturing numerous Nazi agents in the Western Hemisphere, especially in South America. And during that silent war period, before the United States entered World War II, Elizabeth's cryptanalytic work was invaluable against espionage happening there. But again, her accomplishments were once again overshadowed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which ended up taking credit for many of her discoveries. Freeman's work focused on deciphering encrypted messages that were sent from Nazi spies to other foreign agents operating within the United States and around the United States. And she was responsible for breaking numerous different kinds of code and uncovering vital intelligence that led to their apprehension. As part of the Coast Guard Cryptanalytic Unit, which then would later become a part of the Department of Navy, Friedman collaborated with various agencies, including the FBI, in counter-espionage efforts. However, the FBI at the time was led by Director J. Edgar Hoover, who was very eager to build its reputation and strengthen its standing as the nation's premier law enforcement agency. But in doing so, they would end up taking a lot of credit for the successes of Freeman and her team, because they would be the ones at the end apprehending people. But the decrypted messages and intelligence that Freeman and her team gathered were, that was used by the FBI to actually prosecute those apprehensions. And for many years, historians even would credit the FBI, right, for this deciphering work and the field work of, the kind of gumshoe in a suit for breaking up the spy rings in South America and helping us to, win the silent war, both because, Hoover desired to promote himself, but also because of the highly classified nature of the work that Elizabeth was doing. They didn't want to reveal the methods that we were able to decrypt. But the FBI wasn't the one that intercepted the messages. They, didn't break the codes. They didn't have any cipher solving schools. The Coast Guard did all this. And once the documents became public and declassified, it was very obvious, because each document says CG decrypt at the bottom for Coast Guard decrypt. And that was on every document that the Coast Guard created before forwarding them to the FBI or the Department of Defense or the British and other intelligence agencies. And these descriptions really saved lives, stopped fascist coups in South America and drove wedges between Germany and South America as it was trying to court those nations to join the Axis powers. But Freeman's most notable work during World War II was involved in cracking the Enigma machine. So the Enigma was an encryption device used by Germany and the German military to encode and decode messages. It has a complex set of settings that make it virtually impenetrable with billions of possible combinations. But alongside British counterparts, including Alan Turing and his team at Bletchley Park, Freeman helped to devise various techniques to break the Enigma code, which ultimately played a very crucial role in the Allied victory in the war. But Elizabeth's efforts also extended beyond the Enigma machine. She found, there was complex codes used by other Axis powers. She, helped the U.S. and the Allies intercept and understand enemy communication, and that provided valuable insights that, helped set the strategy and the plan for the war, but also was critical in decision making. Right, this information actually included information that ended up saving over 8,000 lives aboard the Queen Mary. So the Queen Mary had been kind of taken over to transport troops over the Atlantic, and it was targeted heavily by Nazi U-boats. And Hitler actually put a personal bounty on the Queen Mary itself, promising the Iron Cross and a bounty of 1 million Reichsmarks to any U-boat captain who was able to sink the Queen Mary. And so following that, United States actually entering the war, Elizabeth remained, doing this highly, highly classified work. And her contributions were probably kept secret, right, to protect her identity, the sensitive nature of the operations she was involved in, right? The intelligence community had learned during the silent part of the war this extreme danger of letting your adversary know if you'd broken their codes, right? It was only many years after the war that her accomplishments were really publicly recognized, revealing the true extent of her impact on World War II. And so this groundbreaking work from from Elizabeth Smith and Elizabeth Smith Freeman and William Friedman in this field of cryptanalysis during the early 20th century became, as I said, the foundation for the modern National Security Agency. Those books that they published, those are still taught at NSA, and William himself founded the Army Signal Corps that would eventually evolve into it. And so they had these pioneering efforts in code breaking. Despite no formal real training, they created the training as they were going. And so that the Army Signal Corps was responsible for intercepting and deciphering foreign communications for the Army. And Elizabeth had shown kind of this power of cryptology during Prohibition and then the early part of World War II when called the Silent War. And so this combined effort really influenced the U.S. government's understanding of the strategic value of cryptology. And as it moved into the Cold War era, that's when the government saw this need for this dedicated agency, right? And so President Harry Truman established the NSA in 1952, which built on that foundation that the Freemans had laid. And so the NSA's primary mission was then and still is to protect and defend U.S. national security systems and produce foreign signals intelligence information. And the agency has obviously, for as many of us know, grown exponentially since its inception, employing now thousands of code breakers, analysts, mathematicians, computer scientists. And originally, the NSA had named an auditorium in Fort Meade, Maryland, which is just down the road from where I live, after William Friedman. And here we can see Elizabeth at the dedication ceremony with a bust of her husband. But when more information became available about Elizabeth Smith Freeman's equally impressive accomplishments, that became public, there was this growing move to recognize her work and understand that it deserved equal recognition. But of course, due to social norms at the time, when she was working and the secret nature of her work, the groundbreaking achievements she had were largely uncredited and hidden from public view until actually after her death. And in response to this increased awareness, though, the NSA actually took the decision to rename the auditorium. And so it's now named to honor both William and Elizabeth. And they changed the name, to show that they, both members of the couple had made significant contributions to the field of cryptanalysis and national security. And so the renaming of that auditorium to honor both of them kind of serves as this testament to their collective legacy in the field of cryptology. It also highlights the importance of recognizing often overlooked work of female code breakers and cryptanalysts whose efforts were instrumental in shaping the course of history and developing modern intelligence practices. And furthermore, the Freeman's cryptology work went beyond their careers together. They both dedicated themselves to the education and mentorship of future generations of cryptanalysts. They were committed to nurturing talent and sharing knowledge. They created this, robust and skilled workforce in the field of cryptology, which, has continued to evolve. So it begs the question, what can we learn from this? How does this kind of tangled web of history, the works of Shakespeare, incorrect theory about their authorship being, Francis Bacon, and then founding, this greatest code-breaking and security-focused organizations in the history of humanity. What can that teach us about what we're doing today to help secure our future? Well, I think the lessons are these. They're critical for understanding both current and future cybersecurity landscape, and I think it will help you and all of us protect ourselves and our organizations against threats. And they go back to the principles that Elizabeth used when she was helping to found the science. So first, let's take a look at interdisciplinary problem solving. So I think the first key takeaway is that, in today's world, cyber threats are increasingly complex, multifaceted. Gone are the days where you could rely on a single technology or methodology to secure the organization. The most effective cybersecurity strategies incorporate actually a diverse set of tools and techniques, drawing upon experience from multiple fields. So we need to incorporate disciplines like psychology, sociology, even economics, right, into your cybersecurity strategy. We've heard a lot of discussion of that this week, because those different methods and ways of thinking can provide insight into how an attacker behaves, how they're motivated, right, and allows you to anticipate and mitigate those threats more effectively. So by fostering this, a culture of interdisciplinary collaboration within your own organization, you can leverage, diverse skills and perspectives from all your team members. And this will provide a holistic approach to problem solving that won't only help you tackle cyber threats, but help drive innovation and adaptability as things change and needs change in your organization. I think the second key takeaway is to think like an attacker, right? In order to effectively defend against cyber threats, you have to understand the mindset and tactics of the adversaries you're facing, right? This is a huge deal for Elizabeth at the time. And so you have to adopt this kind of attacker's perspective when evaluating your own security posture. That's one of the most effective things you can do, yet it's something that we heard earlier, most folks just do once a year with a pen test, right? But by asking yourself questions like, how would I go to exploit this system, or how would I design this code? How would I, what would be the most valuable target for an attacker to start with, right? That can help uncover potential vulnerabilities that might not be immediately apparent. Additionally, if you're conducting those threat assessments regularly and penetration tests regularly, it helps you to simulate real-world attacks and identify the areas where your defenses might be lacking. Right? This is a much more proactive approach to security that enables you to stay one step ahead of your adversaries and minimize the risks. The third takeaway is a reminder that nothing is impenetrable, right? So no matter how robust you think your security measures may be, right? Everyone thought the Enigma was impenetrable, the Titanic's unsinkable. There's always a potential for an attacker to find a way in. So it's crucial to constantly evaluate and improve security posture and defense in depth, right? We have to kind of adopt this mindset of we're going to be continuously improving. There's no end, right? We've got to regularly challenge our own security measures to identify and address where those weaknesses are, because they do exist, right, before they can be exploited by an adversary. So this involves, all the things that we've talked about this week, right? Red team exercises, having a bug bounty program which incentivizes security researchers to help you do this and find vulnerabilities before someone else does. But that requires you to embrace this idea that nothing's perfect. There's no compliance framework that's going to just make you secure. And I think that actually speaks to the most important thing that I think we can take away from Elizabeth's life, right? She was able to speak up, right? And we need to be able to speak up when it's compliance over security, right? Complacence with compliance is killing our ability to actually secure, right? And this is that final takeaway. We've got to address that issue, right? Far too often we see organizations who rely on, well, I'm compliant, and that's my primary security measure. And so compliance with regulations obviously is critical, but it shouldn't be mistaken for a comprehensive security strategy. And complacence with compliance can lead to a false sense of security, actually, leaving you more vulnerable to cyber threats that might not be addressed by an existing regulation that you're looking at. So it's important to go beyond that minimum requirement and proactively implement additional measures. And when you notice that focus is more on ticking the boxes of compliance than on addressing real security concerns, you have to not be afraid to speak up. You have to educate your colleagues and leadership on the importance of robust security measures and the potential consequences of not implementing them. If you foster this culture of continuous improvement, you can help ensure that that's a normal thing that happens every day. So if you return to this idea that started Elizabeth's career, right? Pattern recognition. I said we would come back to that. We can think about how important the human element still is to this day. And it's interesting how full circle we've come, right? Originally, Elizabeth was using pen and pencil to solve these complex codes. And then, of course, today, cryptology is based on computer technology and high-performance computing and some of the most advanced math we've ever developed as a species. Yet, what are we all talking about, especially in the consumer side of technology? We're talking about artificial intelligence, which, in its current form, is really machine learning, large language models, which boil down to trying to reproduce that thing humans are best at, pattern recognition, right? And this time we're trying to do it at scale. And while I think that's going to change the way we work, and AI certainly has this impact, I don't think that it's going to replace the human ability to speak up, right? When you see something, when you see a pattern that's negative and needs to change. So by fostering this interdisciplinary thinking and problem solving, speaking up when complacence with compliance is taking precedence, thinking like an attacker, and remembering that nothing's impenetrable. I believe we all can significantly improve our organization's cybersecurity posture. And when we do, I think we should all take a moment to thank Elizabeth Smith Freeman. Her remarkable accomplishments in the field of cryptanalysis really left an indelible mark on the history of code breaking, cryptology, and the world in general, really. Right? Her contributions and that blazed the way for the modern science of cryptology, matched, maybe only by her husband's, and her expertise and dedication not only paved the way for future generations of cryptanalysts, but also demonstrated the importance of cryptology in protecting the most powerful thing, knowledge. And that's what she had inscribed, as I mentioned at the top, on William's tombstone when he passed away in 1969. Again, we can see the phrase that came to define their lives together: knowledge is power. But again, this is Elizabeth Smith Freeman we're talking about. Nothing can just be normal. This woman would write her kids letters at camp that were actually in ciphertext. She once threw a party where the menu was encoded, and one of the dishes was called a dish mixed together in an inseparable way. It was a ham hash, right? A play on the cryptologic word and the food use of that word. So she couldn't let a simple thing like a tombstone not also have a secret code embedded. So she also described how the letters that spell out knowledge is power should be. They're actually the biformed alphabet. Some have serifs and some do not, making it this AB Baconian cipher, and embedded William's initials once again into the tombstone. So while cryptologists like Elizabeth and William are mere mortals, their impact on society and indeed their hidden messages can outlive them by quite some time. So as we wrap up together, I encourage each of you to reflect on those 4 key takeaways and consider how you can apply them to your organization. Right? Cybersecurity is this ongoing journey, but by adopting these principles, you can better navigate this complex and ever-changing landscape. It's crucial to understand the current and future landscape to help better protect yourself and your organizations against threats. Thank you so much for your time today. And for those who came expecting bacon, well, there you go. I got it for you. But hopefully, even if this I didn't give you the desired treat you were hoping for, you get to start thinking a little bit about what it means to be a modern security engineer. And in the end, that should be able to bring home the bacon for you. Okay, I had to make that joke. I'm sorry. And one more thing. There's this great post from the site Reddit. I think you all remember that site before it disappeared off the internet this week. Anyway, this person mentioned about how when their father quoted this Francis Bacon quote to them when they were young, instead of knowledge is power, Francis Bacon, they heard, of course, the classic SAT statement, knowledge is power, France is bacon. So forget the moon being made out of cheese. I think I have a new favorite food to place analogy, right? And even better, when they asked a question back of their dad. They said, "Did I catch that right, Dad? Francis Bacon?" And their dad said, their dad heard Francis and said, "Yeah, Francis Bacon." So I love this as an example of the things we get taught from our parents that we don't even realize are wrong until much later in life. But again, I think it applies right back to our story. Don't take anything for granted. Just because someone says there's a special code in Shakespeare or that a European country is actually a product from pigs, it doesn't mean those things are true. And it reminded me in the end actually of another great mother of computer science in our field, Admiral Grace Hopper, who once said the most dangerous phrase in the human language is, "We've always done it that way." So I would encourage you all to be like Grace, be like Elizabeth, question everything, and don't assume just because you're new to cybersecurity or you have less experience in something than someone that you have any less to contribute. Thanks again for your time. You can find out more about this presentation, get the slides, and find the book that I read that inspired this talk at nux.gg/bacon. You can also join the Project Discovery Slack if you like. I can answer any questions there, but you can also find me on the internet as @O'Leary Crew most places. Thanks again.